Okay, it has started. So, at the very outset, I welcome you on to the third day of the online lecture series organized by the Department of English, Berhampur Girls College. It goes without saying that the COVID 19 pandemic has thrown new challenges to all the existing domains of the dissemination of knowledge. In this respect, the new circumstances have opened up fresh challenges to the teaching learning scenario. We teachers are adapting ourselves as per the need of the hour and also trying to encourage our students to partake of the new technology driven system of education that remains the best way to stay connected with them at this hour of crisis. Students, particularly of the rural and backward districts of West Bengal, are also faced with an unforeseen situation where the first generation learners are expected to immediately comply with the technology driven system of education with which they were only partially acquainted. Our institution has started online teaching from the very first period of the closure of educational institutions. We are complying with all the directives issued by the Department of Higher Education, Government of West Bengal, and our affiliating university, University of Kalyani. The Department of English has taken the noble initiative of arranging online lecture series for undergraduate and postgraduate students of the department of our college in keeping with the course requirements as well as seeking knowledge beyond the existing domain. The patron of the online lecture series, Professor Niladri Ranjan Chatterjee, Professor and Head Department of English, University of Kolani, was present on the first day of the OLS. The Department of English, University of Kolani and Professor Chatterjee has always guided us in our academic pursuits. The chief patron of the OLS, Dr. Hena Sinha, Principal Berhampur Girls College, has supported us in best possible ways. I welcome today's resource person, Dr. Shaurik Bhattacharya, lecturer in post-colonial studies, School of Critical Studies, University of Glasgow. His talk, I sincerely hope, would open new dimensions of thought for the faculty and students alike. In this respect, I also appreciate the initiative taken by the teachers of the Department of English, the conveners, the joint secretaries. Obviously, as conveners, we have Professor Parthoprtim Mondol and Professor Binoy Dangor. As organizing secretary, there is our senior associate professor, Professor Kea Bhotto, and me myself. As members, we have Srimati Koel Ganguly and Sri Kajol Kumar Shaha. I therefore, without much delay, announce the official opening of the online lecture series today at 4:30 p.m. Over to you, PPM.
Thank you, Parthoda. So let me first of all uh, give you a very brief introduction of what Dr. Saurit Bhattacharya has achieved in a very short space of time, and that's very remarkable. He is lecturer in post-colonial studies at the University of Glasgow. His research interests include post-colonial literatures, disaster and food security studies, translation studies, literary theory and form. His works have appeared in such journals as Ariel, Textual Practice, Irish University Review, and in edited volumes like Magic Realism and Literature, published by Cambridge, Post-Colonial Urban Outcasts, Routledge, Aesthetics and Politics of Global Hunger, Palgrave, and others. His first monograph, Post-Colonial Modernity and the Indian Novel, on catastrophic realism was published by Palgrave in June 2020, very recently. His co-edited volume on Nabarun Bhattacharya, is out from Bloomsbury now. Shaurit is a founder co-editor of Sanglap, Journal of Literary and Cultural Enquiry. And let me add this because I know him personally. Uh, he is a man with a gifted sense of humor, something that's probably quite underrated these days. He's a man with a great sense of humor and a great thinker, very conscious, very conscious about the social and cultural and the political changes around him. And the way I have seen him, he is really an inspiration. So at the end of our discussion, we are going to have an interactive session, and I would uh, like to take this liberty to urge you to ask, even if you want to ask something outside of the subject that you would be covering, anything you want to ask about studying abroad or higher studies which you want to pursue in Europe, or any other such familiar questions related to higher studies. So, so I now would request Dr. Saurit Bhattacharya to kindly deliver this lecture. Saurit, over to you.
Right. Am I audible, Partha?
Yes, nice.
Okay,
It's good.
great. So first of all, thank you so much, Professor Mondol, and uh, the organizing committee members of Berhampur Girls College for the kind invitation. Uh, I would rather say Parthoda because as Parthoda was saying, we have known each other for a long time, and we've shared very nice memories also from our undergraduate and postgraduate days. Parthoda is a great cricketer, and we have been sort of playing cricket together. So in a sense, um, when he invited me for this talk, there was no way that I was not going to give the talk. It's just that it has been a matter of, as he was saying in the beginning, not only like a global pressure point because of the pandemic, but also things have now transitioned online in terms of teaching. So whatever we used to do for 1 hour has become now 3 hour because of the kind of additional stuff that we have to do in order to do sort of teach online. So I have been like, both of us have been trying to find out a good date. And it's unfortunate that it has to be on a weekend, but I'm sure like the talk will be something not too much in that sense, too deep or too unsettling to sort of, but also not without sort of compromising the rigors of it. So thank you so much again for the kind invitation. So as I said, you can understand the title of it all, How to Read Literature. Now, in the last few months or so, I've been giving talks, especially in the areas of, let's say, eco-criticism, post-colonial eco-criticism, or let's say post-colonial studies, hunger and disaster studies. These are areas that I'm broadly interested in and I work. And these are areas that have not been widely talked about. Like how many of you have come across terms such as disaster literary studies, right? Literature based on disasters and literary studies or literary theories based on disasters. On the other hand, you will note that India or Bengal, for instance, or any country, they would have their share of disasters, and yet literature has been slow in registering in its form and content the element of disasters. How many times have you come across novels based on earthquakes or floods or sort of famines, right? So why is there a paucity? Why do novelists or writers or critics feel, let's say, shy about writing is this sort of disasters in their work? Do disasters actually prevent literary or cultural work? Does it demand kind of melodramatic attention to form? So these are questions that I have been dealing with in my research. But more and more, I have been conscious of the fact that in our training in literary theory and literary studies, what we have not always been attentive to is how to read. And that's not, and that reflects on all of us, like teachers and students alike, that we have been trained to teach literature theoretically from a particular sort of career of your life, be it second year, third year, or in your MA, etc. And they're all very useful and very important, that you know the depth of it, the subtleties of reading literature, of course. And I do not repudiate that. The point here, of course, on the other hand, is in order to bring, let's say, a plethora of theoretical readings, not very often have we been loyal to literary readings. And when I say literary readings, I say, let's say, close readings. And that's precisely where the title comes in, How to Read Literature. By this, I do not mean to say again that close readings are devoid of theoretical readings. Of course, they are part of theory. The moment you try to read something, you're always embarking on a theoretical reading. But what I'm trying to do here in this particular presentation, and when we discussed, Barthoda and I discussed the topic, both of us agreed that there is a need to remind us that literature is as much to be enjoyed as to be instructed with, right? To be conveyed a message with. So to bring that back, or let's say to go back to the basics about how to read literature, what I'm going to show you in the next slides, it's not more than 8 or 9 slides I have, so it's going to be more of a discussion, that how I understand, and this is exactly, I would like to make sure in the beginning that these are my understandings. I'm not saying that this has to be the understanding, and my understandings will have the limitations as well. So in the beginning, as Parthoda was also saying, I would like to ask you to make sure any questions that you have, any clarifications that you need, please feel free to write them in the chat box. So when we are done with the slides and the presentation, I could go back and pick those things up. The point here in the presentation is to make sure that we are as much on the same page as possible. So with that, let me share my slide. Just a minute, please. Right. Sometimes it takes a little bit time to sort of, because I can't see on Google Meet my screen or your screen. Could one, like Parthoda, maybe like confirm that you can see the screen?
I can't see it yet, Rohit.
Can you see?
Visible.
Okay, so the slides. Okay, that's great. So I'll now move on with the slides. So this is let's again, as I said in the beginning, that let's start with the basics. So these are the two things, and I would also like to make sure in the beginning, and I'm keeping a tab on my time as well, that literature is a big thing, right? It includes so many different genres. So let's focus on one genre, and I'll be focusing here on poetry. And what I will do here is that, first of all, I will introduce the term poetry and sort of do a bit of a, let's say, close theoretical reading of how poetry makes meaning. Okay, and then we'll give you 2 examples. So first of all, how poetry makes meaning. Second is what happens to poetry for people like us, like Indians, or people who have had a colonial history. Does poetry change, or does it have a different kind of a formal register when somebody writes from the colonial territories which have also been disaster territories? Just to remind you, when famine was almost over from Europe, it started coming back again and again in the colonial territories. A lot of social scientists have actually said that these famines were manufactured. These were historical famines, famines which could have been avoided if this kind of agrarian transitions or agrarian agricultural changes wouldn't have been happening overnight, or if imperialism, which was mainly cash crop imperialism, was or could be avoided. Now, that's where I come in, that what happens about poetry, let's say, or literature, where it is not written from the metropolis of London or England or New York or Paris or somewhere else like Vienna. It is written from the colonial territories. Does literature, or in that sense, in our example, poetry, go through a few changes in terms of its form, in terms of its content, registered? So that's the kind of historical understanding I want you to give at this point of time, that for me, reading a particular piece of literature is also to remind myself that it is a product of a particular time period, and I cannot have completely ignored that aspect of it. Of course, that doesn't mean that you cannot read literature without taking it away from its time and autonomously, but I tend to do also to find out how to situate it in its in its context, in its historical specificities. So with that, let me go. So with these definitions. So what is literature? And I've taken it from, just to keep it like neutral, both of them from Oxford English Dictionary. So literature, the definition is written works, especially those considered of superior or lasting artistic merit. Look at that, superior or lasting artistic merit. So very clearly the meaning of it carries a very strong class value, right? A very strong historical value. What is of superior or lasting artistic merit is not clear, right? Would, let's say, a novel or a poem written by or considered as popular be literature? Is it superior or lasting artistic merit? These are contentious terms, okay? But let us take it as a definition. In the very first definition, OED sets up a very contentious issue, right? That is something of superior or lasting, but lasting is a very important thing. I mean, Shakespeare, we do, right? It's like 1594, 1600. So this is definitely lasting artistic merit and the definition of literature, a great work of literature. Again, then books and writings published on a particular subject, like literature review, we say. And final one, look at that, leaflets and other printed matter used to advertise products or give advice. So that's also part of literature. That's also the definition of literature, not necessarily the definition in its more literary sense, but the broad understanding of literature, which is also the literature of literature review. If we now move on from that particular understanding, that literature stands for something of artistic merit and value, and something which is also broad in its framework. Today, literature could include graffiti, could include leaflets, could include, as there is already there, this kind of artistic merit, even broadly art. Now, to move it to a more specific genre, poetry, the definition is literary work in which the expression of feelings and ideas is given intensity by the use of distinctive style and rhythm, poems collectively or as a genre of literature. So look at the definition here. Distinctive style and rhythm. That's very important, right? To sort of consider what is actually understood as poetry, or as different from, let's say, play or a novel. Second, a quality of beauty and intensity of emotion regarded as characteristic of poems, something regarded as comparable to poetry in its beauty. See, all these definitions from OED make sure that poetry is about beauty, is about emotion, is about a distinctive rhythm and style, is about something different, right, from the prose style. This is not necessarily true. We have seen prose poetry. We have seen that poetic prose. We have seen prose fiction as poetic sort of poetry as a mover or as a genre. But as I said, just to start with these definitions, and these definitions are already contentious. To start with these definitions, poetry stands for something. Okay, so with this particular understanding, let me move on to how to read poetry. Right. So this is how poetry makes meaning. Right. And something that I wanted you to remember is the attentiveness that it demands. to its language and form. Now, this is taken from Terry Eagleton, a prominent literary critic, who wrote this book called How to Read a Poem, came out in 2007. So I'm just going to be reading out the sort of green bold part, okay? It is significant, in fact, that if you broach the question of form with students of literature, some of them think that you are talking simply about meter. Paying attention to form in their eyes means saying whether the poem is written in iambic pentameters or whether it rhymes. Literary form obviously includes such things, but saying what the poem means and then tagging on a couple of sentences about its meter or rhyme scheme is not exactly engaging with the questions of form. Most students faced with a novel or poem spontaneously come up with what is commonly known as content analysis. Now, this is something I wanted you to think about, that if a poem is to be understood through its content analysis, why would somebody choose to write a poem and not a piece of prose fiction or journalism? Direct journalistic writings, like you have seen so many coming out these days in webzines or sort of newslets like The Scroll, The Wire, etc., then print. All of these sort of tiny 500 words, 1,000 words kind of sort of articles or columns. You would see that the content will be described and sometimes often in a poetic form. That's fine, all right, but why would then somebody choose to write a poem about something? What is the distinctiveness in style and rhythm? Where is the distinctiveness in its beauty? This is something to remind ourselves that poetry demands a different reading from prose. You are not supposed to be finishing one chapter after another. When you are reading a poem, it has to be slow, it has to be acknowledging of its rhythm, of its meter, and also of the very important thing that Eagleton says later on is of how the meter, rhythm, and style, they contribute to creating or to contributing or sort of enriching the content of it all. Look at what he writes in the second quote. So these are some critics. He talks about, I'm sure like some of you might be familiar with already, F.R. Leavy's I.A. Richards kind of practical criticism. Again, the green part, okay? All of these critics, along with the others I have mentioned, were deeply responsive to social history in however nostalgic or idealist a fashion. Yet all of them, to adopt a phrase of Frederick Jamison's, felt at the same time, and I quote, an obligation to come to terms with the shape of the individual sentences themselves. Look at the sentence here. I would like you to consider this sentence, an obligation to come to terms with the shape of the individual sentences themselves. This is very important. If a poet chooses to write a longer sentence, like a longer line, and then a shorter, maybe like a monosyllabic sort of line next one, there is a strategy and a reason behind it. And those things need to be taken care of. That's why somebody, and in choosing to write a monosyllabic sentence or a monosyllabic word, as a line, as the second line with maybe like a space, these suggest a particular crisis that is being talked about in the content aspect of the poem. The content would mostly be a poem or a poet be engaging with in an oblique fashion. The content is not always very clear, especially in modernist sort of poetry. But the form and the style in which they are written, the poems are written, they will contribute to enriching the content or to helping you out with what the poet is going through right now, historically speaking, about its content, be it like, let's say, the war. Think about Wilfred Owen as a war poet, right? So I'll come back to give you a few examples to how I read. As I said in the beginning, this is how I read. And I believe that in order to be attentive to form and language and to sort of situate a poet, one needs to historicize a poet as well, or a poem. So I'll move on with this another quote from a German thinker and a very prominent social critique, Theodor Adorno. He wrote this sort of essay called On Lyric Poetry and Society in the volume Notes to Literature. Now, this is, consider what Adorno is saying, and I'm trying to make sure that these quotes are not deeply sort of very difficult. Okay, so I'll explain if there is a problem. And as I said in the beginning, feel free to write in the chat box if there is a problem. You experience lyric poetry as something opposed to society, something wholly individual. Your feelings insist that it remains so, that lyric expression, having escaped from the weight of material experience, evoke the image of a life free from the question of reading practices, of utility, of the relentless pressures of self-preservation. This demand, the demand that the lyric word be virginal, is itself social in nature. It implies a protest against the social situation that every individual experiences as hostile, alien, cold, oppressive, and the situation is imprinted in reverse on the poetic work. The more heavily a situation weighs upon it, the more firmly the work resists it by refusing to submit to anything heteronomous and constituting itself solely in accordance with its own laws. I'll just explain the final bit a little. So there is an expectation from us that lyric poetry will not talk about social crisis. Lyric poetry will be about love, romance, lyricism, the beauty of it all. Look at the Bollywood songs, right? The lyrics. How many of them talk about social crisis? But they do, right? Many of them do. And this is what Adorno is telling us, that we expect the lyric not to be talking about that is also social in nature. It's not that, and that's the expectation itself is social in nature, precisely because we encounter such an alienating, cold, and hostile world because of capitalism, because of colonialism. Our bodies and our minds have become alienated from the communities we live with. Our labor, our hands have become labor rather than the whole body with which we have agriculturally involved ourselves previously. Precisely, and the cultural forms were also communal and also community oriented. Now they have become more individualistic, such as the novel writing, such as the novel reading, where you are reading a novel or a poetry or even watching Netflix in the corner of your house. You're not watching them together. And even today, with the coronavirus on and the film theaters are all closed, the communal watching is also gone. In that particular sense, if the world is such, then we expect the lyric to be about something not about the world. We are escaping, we are seeing an escape in the lyric. Let us not the lyric be also about sort of death, about social crisis. And that is itself a social expectation. That's what Adorno reminds us, that if we are reading poetry, lyrics, and we are finding that it is consciously moving away from the social crisis, that itself, that lyric in its form and in its content, by avoiding the social crisis, has thrust upon itself the social form. So that's the kind of reading that Adorno and Eggleton remind us, that we remember that attentiveness to language and form are absolutely crucial to understand how a poem makes meaning, as much as the content aspect of it, of course. And here is the final bit of the theoretical part I said about poetry and colony, right? Remember, Adorno is writing from, let's say, Germany, let's say Frankfurt, or let's say New York, when he was based later on. Terry Eagleton is writing from Britain. Now, these people that I referred to, and I remind you again and again, do not take their words for granted, right? They're writing about their experiences, and these are not universal words, but these are effective words, effective analysis to give you a path to tread on. But we write from a territory, say, for instance, Buddhadev Bose, a Bengali poet, or Premendra Mitro, Samar Sen, these are Bengali poets in the 1940s, or Mahashweta Devi, writing in the 70s and 80s, writing from a culturally and geographically and historically specific aspect or a period. Mahashweta Devi in the 70s and 80s, or all of the other poets I mentioned in the 40s, in the kind of late colonial time period, right? So they will all be even if they agree with the fact, even if they're translating T.S. Eliot and Buddhadev Bose and others, they translated modernist European poets into Bengali and were eventually influenced by them. But that doesn't mean that T.S. Eliot was not influenced by African art, or Picasso was not influenced by African or South American art. So the influences are always mutual. And we are taught to think that it's only the European masters who have given a gateway to the colonial poet. No, not at all. This has been happening as a kind of an international framework, right? And that framework is not always taught or talked about by critics who tell us how to read. And that's the thing that we also need to think about, how to open up the archive, how to open up the canon, how to do more theoretical, in that sense, more inquisitive research about how T.S. Eliot himself was influenced, let's say, maybe by an African writer, right? That doesn't come across quite often in research. So here is something that I want to remind you, that being based in the 40s and 50s India or Nigeria or Kenya, it was not easy to bring a particular from Europe and then implement it in the novel genre. It had to be refashioned to sort of register the problems and the crisis people are going through on a daily basis in a particular territory. Think about the 1940s, right? 1940s, Calcutta, I'm talking about. First of all, the Second World War, 1939 and to 45, Calcutta bombings are happening. 1942, Quit India movement has a very violent take or sort of form in Calcutta. And then 43, the famine comes. 44, 45, the Tevada movement, they have their repercussions. 46, 45, 46, the naval mutiny has also has its repercussion, Calcutta being the erstwhile capital, right? And then 46, the communal riots. 47, the independence. 47, also the partition. And then later on the food movement. This is a tremendously turbulent decade, something that Tanika Sarkar, historians Tanika Sarkar and the Shekhar Bandyopadhyay have called a stormy decade. If a decade is so stormy, and even if with all of these things alongside, everyday life is going on, people are still searching for jobs, etc., taking care of their families, how do you write poetry? How do you write poetry just to sort of imitating people like T.S. Eliot or somebody else, or having a relatively comforting sort of, or a different historical or geographical or cultural aspect altogether to them? So that's something you remember when you read poetry as well. And that's why I remind you that the historical specificity is very important, or rather the geographical specificity. We can't talk about poetry and then generalize it without acknowledging the specificity aspect of it all. So this is what a post-colonial scholar, scholar of poetry, Jahan Ramazani says in his book, A Transnational Poetics, that in brief, poets from decolonizing nations and from the heart of empire seek verbal and formal correlatives for the sudden unraveling of empire and the volcanic emergence of new nations, both rejoicing in the global unbinding that is decolonization, and skeptically asking whether political independence affords a true break with the past or more of the same under new levels. I'll not go ahead with the quote. Point being that two things are happening here. One, as I said, the kind of terrible decade that everybody is going through in the 40s in colonial territories. Every colonial territory is going through tremendous crisis in the 40s and 50s. I'm not talking about India only or South Asia. I'm talking about Nigeria. I'm talking about Kenya. I'm talking about South Africa. So this is the kind of understanding that if this is going on, the kind of crisis, and then there is also this hope that there will be an end of colonial rule and a liberation, then there is the hope, but then there is also the sort of skepticism that will that be at all a new generation where we'll all be free, we'll all be equal, or will that be just a transfer of power from the British to the ruling elite, to the bourgeoisie, or to the sort of capitalists, right? Where we're continuing with the same situation. And these, as you can understand, these skepticisms or these sort of anticipations were not entirely untrue. It just happened that the transfer of power happened from one elite to the other without having completely taken cognizance of what is happening with the oppressed classes, right? Happening with the oppositional classes. So that's something that Ramazani reminds us, that the poetry of Derek Walcott, Camus Brathwaite, Lorna Goodison, Okot, Christian Okot, all of these poets from South America and Africa, they're showing in their poetry, in their form, this kind of duality of both anticipation of a brilliant future, sort of an equal future, but at the same time, the skepticism of disillusionment that could also lie within it. And then I'd also give you a very quick quote by Upamanyu Pablo Mukherjee. He reminds us that Victorian time period was full of disasters. As I said in the beginning, something that I study also, disasters such as famines, such as plagues, such as, look at what we are going through right now, the pandemic, like the influenza sort of disaster. And then look at, I mean, we have had at least 5 or 6 devastating famines in India in the 19th century, and then followed by cholera. So one after another, and then smallpox. So the point is, we have never organized literature around these disasters. If you organize literature around disasters, you get a completely different understanding of literature and literary form. Something that I'm trying to do in my own work, to historicize literature around sort of disasters. So he tells us that because the British thought that India or colonial territories were inherently, immanently disaster geographies, and they thought that these are environments which are, as he said, disaster environment, where disaster happen one after another. And by disaster, he meant not only an earthquake, but also, like, slow disasters such as a famine or starvation, etc., etc. So according to Pablo Mukherjee, disaster environment, the final line of it, demanded disaster styles of writing. These disaster styles of writing might not always conform to something that, remember the definition of literature, of superior or everlasting merit. It might not. It is not Rabindranath's Gora or Home and the World, like Ghore Baire. It is not, let's say, Charles Dickens's Great Expectations. These are not about disasters. And these we have come to realize as the specimen of great literature, right? Charlotte Bronte, Jane Eyre, Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice, specimen of great literature. They might not be about disasters. They might be about a slow social crisis, about not at all any social crisis at all. And these we have come to realize or subscribe or ascribe greatness to them, that they make more sense. But more often you would see that, look at Tolstoy's War and Peace, war, right? War is also a disaster. So how we see this kind of disaster, especially from colonial territories full of sort of catastrophes, and how we read and register and attempt to write literature from those territories will be key to understanding poetry, to understanding literature in general. So if we start from Eggleton's and Adorno's understanding that poetry demands not only an acuteness and acute attentiveness to its language and form, we have to also remember where the poetry is written from. The poetry from a colonial disaster geography probably will demand further additional things that somebody such as T.S. Eliot or somebody such as, let's say, Stephen Mallarmé, writing from France, would not be probably thinking about or anticipating in their writing. So that's why I thought we need to do not only close readings, but also we need to remember the specificity of it all and the comparative framework that a poet such as Buddhadev Bose finds in T.S. Eliot, a spirit, an angst, the sort of a Zeitgeist, the kind of a, let's say, the spirit of its time. T.S. Eliot writing in 1910, 20s, and Buddhadev Bose 1940s and 50s, finding that kind of spirit across borders. That's the comparative aspect of it. Literature is inherently comparative. When you read something, when you think about something, you always think that is how psychologists tell us, we always think in a comparative cognition framework, that whenever we see a bird or a tree, we do not know them, we always try to give them a knowledge, a familiar name to it. Okay, it looks like a doel bird, it looks like sort of a papaya tree, something like that. We always tend to compare whatever we do not know through our familiar vocabulary. And that's also how we do literature. That's something that we don't understand, or something that we always implicitly continue to compare. So remember, if this is a comparison going on, we need to also acknowledge the specificities of this all. So with that in mind, let me now move on to two poems, one from Bengal, one from the US. This is a poem that many of you might have already come across in school or in college. It's called O Mohajibon by Shukanto Bhattacharya, written in 1946. This is because this is now, I mean, what I plan to do here, I'm not going to be doing a long reading of this poem, but what I plan to do is remind you of how this poetry was written and what does it tell us, and then move you to a different context altogether and find out sort of comparative resonances, as I said, without sacrificing the specificity of it all. So this is Shukanto writing this poem in 1946 at a time, and in 1947 he will die of tuberculosis. He died at the age of 21. I'm not going to be introducing Shukanto here, taking for granted the thing that either you know him or that his sort of biography is easily available online. Now, the point here, he's writing this poem, "Oh Great Life, No More Poetry Again," in the wake of the food crisis, in the wake of the, understandably, this poem was written in 1944 but came out in 46. So in the wake of the 1943 Bengal famine. I don't know whether how many of you know that he also wrote a poem called Robindranather Proti to Robindranath, where he said that I'm a poet of famine days. আমি দুর্ভিক্ষের কবি। আমি যতটাই, as much as I love you, as much as I admire you, I am not a poet of a relatively peaceful, more peaceful days. I'm a poet of famine days, and I see things, not the beauty of the world, but only people queuing up for food. Look, and this is a 19-year-old writing, right? Very sensitive. And this poem is he was born in 1926. This is a 20-year-old writing. But look, the maturity of his thinking and the attentiveness to form. He starts with, "Oh Great Life," and I've done a sort of translation from Jagannath Chakraborty. "Oh Great Life, no more poetry again. Let me instead invoke hard and sturdy prose. Let the soft lilting of words and their jingling be gone. Let the stiff hammer of prose strike close. There is no need of the softness of poetry. I grant you leave today, poetry, my mate. In the land of hunger, prose is everywhere. The full moon hangs like a piece of fire-baked bread." Now, the final line, I think many of you who know Bangla will know that Purnima Chad Jano Jhalsano Ruti. Even to think about a line like that, just to do a quick reading, like an analysis of it. Look, what he's saying, that no more poetry again. We are going through a time period of food crisis and immense pressures of sort of not only related to food and shelter, but also related to bombings and war. And poetry is not able to talk about this prosaic everyday lives we are having. Poetry is more about the lilting words, the lyric. Remember Adorno, right? But what is he saying here? Remember, no more poetry again. Let me instead invoke hard and sturdy prose. Let the lilting of words and their jingling be gone. So this is the poetry that he has in mind. A poetry which is soft, romantic, lyric, that rhymes with lilting words and jingling. Let, on the other hand, stiff hammer of prose. Look at the juridical imagery, that the stiff hammer, a conclusive nature of prose, as if prose are always about conclusions, about a sort of decisions, about the hardness of it all, which poetry cannot retain because of its slipperiness, because of its romanticism. There is no need of the softness of poetry. I grant you leave, right? The world is full of prose because of the world of hunger. The full moon is like the fire-baked bread. And that's very important because before Shukanto and the kind of Kollolera like poets, especially writing in the 30s and 40s, moon had a very clear romantic, by romantic with a capital R, I mean, from Walter de la Mare, from the kind of romantic school of writing in Britain, had a very strong romantic sort of underpinning about beauty, about emotion, about association with nature, beautiful nature, about songs. Here, look at the change of it all. The striking nature of the image shows the birth of modern poetry here, that moon doesn't look like, to people who have no access to food, moon doesn't look like something of a matter of beauty. It just looks like, it simulates, it looks like sort of a fire baked bread, like basically cholchano roti, if I could just hold it and eat it. And that's the striking nature. The striking aspect of the poem is eventually lost to us precisely because we have probably come across as Bangalis this poem so often and read so often in school that this nature of it, that the moon could be compared with Ruti, is lost, right? Uh, the class aspect of it, the destitute, the caste aspect of it, that these are lost to us. But if we now go back again, as I said, back to the basics, go back and sometimes remind us what he's asking. Remember, Shukanto is not saying poetry, I will not write poetry. Look, he's just writing poetry. He is writing poetry by saying that I will not write poetry. What he is actually, let's say, declaring a war against is a kind of poetry, lyrical poetry which is modernist in style, poetry of, let's say, Buddhadev and the Lord and the camp that he was not part with. He was a member of the Communist Party, and he was also a vocal supporter, a sort of a campaigner for people without any food. And he was like an activist, and he was also an editor of a children's magazine, Kishore Shobha Bahini or something, as I remember. So he was actually dissociating himself with the kind of poetry that Buddhadev Bose and the camp were writing, Shodindranath Dotto and also Jivananando, about convoluted and about crisis in a matter that doesn't appeal to the public. And he wrote in several of his letters to his aunts and friends that I am a poet of the public. I'm a people's poet. Now, as I again understand that, remember that he's a 20-year-old, right? And hopefully he would probably go on writing like that if he had been alive till 40, 50, 60, 70 years. But even as a 20-year-old with sometimes of the kind of so the kind of youthful rebelliousness that you see in 20 years, and he has written poems like 18 Bachar Boyesh. And then you would also see the striking maturity of his writing. He is changing the entire form of writing. He's bringing an octave, 8-line poem, an octave, to talk about poetry, right? To talk about the hardness of poetry, to remind us that minimalism, if we have to follow that, then minimalism also has the beauty of its poetry, without sacrificing the imagery aspect of it all. Very quickly again to the second poem, and I'm very sorry for the fact that this has to be done. This is like slightly, the font is really short and small, and I think, but something that I wanted you to know is that, and I think you already know it, you have this poem in your syllabus, right? Caged Bird by Maya Angelou, and the poem is about, let's say, moving ahead from being into a bondage to a world of free life, and the kind of distinction that the poet makes between bondage and freedom. A free bird lives, a free bird leaps on the back of the wind and floats downstream till the current ends, and dips his wing in the orange sun rays and dares to claim the sky. But a bird that stalks down his narrow cage can seldom see through his bursts of rage. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. I will not go ahead with this poem because of time, but I'm also asking you to remember, because I'm sure some of you have already read this poem, is look at the distinction being made in the first two stanzas of what does a free bird look like and what it does, and what does a caged bird look like and what it does, right? So look at also something that Terry Higgleton reminds us we do sometimes as we are versification, prosody and rhetoric, right? The prosody part of it all. A free bird leaps on the back of the wind and floats downstream till the current ends, and dips his wing in the orange run rays and dares to claim the sky. Look, the continuance, in a sense, the shuffling of monosyllabic and di or trisyllabic words. A free bird leaps. The second one, it seems like changes entirely to monosyllabic. But a bird that stalks down his narrow is a disyllabic cage, can seldom again a disyllabic, see through his bursts of rage, his wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. The tremendous thudding of the monosyllables just shows that if a free bird demands lyricism, demands a beauty, a kind of a dynamism in its form, because it's sort of flying, and it is flapping its wings. It's soaking the sun, the orange of the sun. The beauty of it all demands dynamism in form. On the other hand, the caged bird is probably just flapping and tossing and thudding into the cage to come out. That thuddingness needs to be brought into poetry. And that is where the monosyllables come in. But that is where it doesn't end. The poetry doesn't end there. If you remember again Eagleton's suggestions, look at, I'd bring in two contexts here. First of all, Maya Angelou is writing in the 70s and 80s. In the 70s, US is going through, especially from the 60s onwards, and Maya Angelou is a US poet, right? Is an African-American poet. The US as a nation is going through tremendous turbulence in the 60s, relatively peaceful, more peaceful during the war because it decided to stay away from war. But in the 60s, and once the war is over, it sees that, okay, I can now rule the world. Now that Europe is moving backward, Europe is sort of shrinking away, liberating its colonies. I can now move ahead and rule. And let's start my war with Russia, with the USSR. Both of them are now the big superpowers, right? Russia is saying, okay, I can rule now. Let's move on. That's when the Cold War, we know that otherwise known as the Third World War, begins. Two camps, one the USA, one the USSR, which again in the fall of Berlin Wall and the eventual disintegration of the USSR, what is understood as the USA has won. Right. So this is the kind of, but whether USA has won or whether it was always a matter of sort of skepticism and crisis from around is something to consider later on or for yourselves. But the point is, because it's happening in the 60s and 70s, US history is also going through a turbulent period in the 60s and 70s. Remember, then the 60s shows the civil rights movement in the US, and especially in elsewhere. 60s also sees the student uprising in France. Right, and the student uprising is related, sees immense sort of opening up in the US. Then we see the Vietnam War, where US is directly engaged with. Once again, huge uprising in the US against sort of supporting the military and unjust war in Vietnam. And then again, sort of Martin Luther King will be assassinated. And so more and more sort of strength comes out from the Harlem, from the Black Arts movement. And this is where people like James Baldwin, Maya Angelou, Angela Davis, these people are born more as poets, writers, artists, and activists. Right? This is the Maya Angelou setup. And this is the poem's historical context, that the bird wants to come out. If you cage the bird, it will just flap around and the sound will be thudding. The sound will be of claustrophobia. The sound will be of dying. Remember the song by Lalon Fokir, Khachar Bhitor Ochin Pakhi, Kemne Ashe Jai. In that particular song, if you remember the wording of it all, what it does is trying to understand a metaphorical understanding of a bird. And if I could just hold it and sort of, tie a kind of a chain around it, the kind of metaphor for the mind, the way thinking process goes. But here, it is not what Maya Angelou is doing, reminding us that I am caged. I am born caged and I am born sort of restricted. And you want me to be human alongside you while you do not give me my freedom. This is slavery part 2. When you have said that slavery is over, but you were actually making sure that we do not progress anywhere. We do not progress in education. We do not progress in jobs. We do not progress in administration. And you want us to give our share of freedom without giving us the legitimacy of freedom. So that's where the poem comes in. And if you now remember, see, as I wanted you to remember, and I'm moving on to the final words here. If you now remember the context that Shukanto is writing, Shukanto has written poems such as Lenin. Shukanto has written poems such as Rabindranath's Proti, such as Bibriti. In all of these poems, Shukanto is telling us that our world needs liberation, that we are caught now, and it demands a revolution to get to the other world. So that kind of cagedness, freedom, bondage will also be reflected in the way Sukanto writes, even if it is the bondage of food crisis and famine, that we are still caged within the bondage of food crisis. And to us who are actually suffering food crisis and starvation, Purnima Chad doesn't look like Purnima Chad and thing of beauty, but just another piece of bread. I wish I could have that. That kind of bondedness, that kind of sort of bondage that Sukanto discusses, and that reflects very strongly in the way that he writes. He decides to go for a eight-liner, an eight-line poem rather than writing line after. And look at Maya Angelou. She's also talking about bondage. She's also very clearly talking about unfreedom. And what she does, unlike Sukanto, whose poetry has been translated into English, but here in the original poem in English, we see that how tiny lines, a free bird leaps on the cage. The dynamism of it all is being showed in two different stanzas, something that Bijon Bhattacharya used in his play Navanno with Shambhu Mitro, where if you remember, some of you have read the play, they remember that two sides of a play of a particular action where one is having a huge ceremony, a wedding ceremony with food wastage going on. On the other side, there are people like Radhika, Kunjo, and others who are eating from dumpsters, who are eating from sort of the food being thrown away. Two sides being shown onto the stage through the change of light, the light direction. That's the modernism coming in theater. So here also we see two sides of it all, freedom and bondage, in two stanzas. And if you remember, first stanza, the words go slow and the words go in disyllables and trisyllables, but the sentences are short. In the second one, the sentences are mostly short or shorter, but also very clearly, prominently monosyllabic to create that stiff, as Sukanto said, the stiffness of juridical image, right? And if you see as it goes on, it becomes even shorter for the caged bird and even better for the kind of, the free bird thinks of another breeze. Look at the fourth stanza. And the tread which soft through the sighing trees, and the fat worms waiting on a torn bright lawn, and he names the sky his own. But a caged bird stands on the grave of dreams. His shadow shouts on a nightmare scream. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, and so he opens his throat to sing. Look at the distinction. Both of them have been given throughout this poem. Both these birds have been given the equal measure. Small, long sentences, short, long stanzas. But in one, the imagery is very clear. Beauty, positivity, light, dynamism, color. The second one has been given everything but the other side of it. Nightmare, scream, clipped, tied, all of these imagery, right? So this is something we have to remember when we read literature, that especially for poetry, we have to be very attentive to its form, to its stanza, as much as its content. The form and the style will remind us that there is a particular social crisis that Maya Angelou or Sukanto Bhattacharya are going through, that they want to capture in their poetry. And that is precise, and they have chosen to write poetry and not a journal article or a newspaper article. They want to tell us through this tininess of their stanzas or their form or their eight-liners that they have been able to struggle with how to capture, how to register the crisis. And they believe that this eight-liner or this tiny sort of monosyllables are able to register that kind of crisis that they are going through. Something that Adorno reminds us, that by not allowing the lyric the possibility of the social, we are actually thirsting the social onto it. With this, I would like to stop, and I would like to know if you have any questions from this talk. Finally, this is the final line. So this is Paul Celan, a German language poet, and I wanted you to have a very quick notation before stopping. This is called the towardness of poetry. Okay, very, very quick. A poem being an instance of language, hence essentially dialogue, may be a letter in a bottle thrown out to sea, with the, surely not always strong, hope that it may somehow wash up somewhere, perhaps on a shoreline of the heart. In this way, too, poems are en route. They are headed toward what? Toward something open, inhabitable, an approachable you, perhaps an approachable reality. Poems, in that sense, as Paul Celan says, the German poet, it's always they're having like some kind of a towardness. It always means something more than that is possible from within the 8 line or the sort of monosyllabic thuddingness of it all. And that towardness need not be missed. And that's precisely why poetry is a particular genre of literature, not because Oxford English Dictionary thinks poetry is about beauty and about particular rhythm and style. Poetry has this towardness of it all, something that transgresses much more than prose does. So with this in mind, and with Shukanto and Maya Angelou's poems as examples to think about, I would like to stop this presentation here. So thank you so much.
Okay, so it was definitely a very, very engaging speech. I would I would always be grateful to you for that. And I think this now we are going to begin our interactive session, and this would be started by our teacher, our professor Koel Ganguly. So Koel, over to you now.
Thank you, Partha Pratimda. First and foremost, I thank you wholeheartedly, Dr. Shorit Bhattacharya, for your intimate, nuanced, insightful, and extremely fascinating lecture. Now I would just forward you some questions put by the students of the department. Nipanjali Roy, student of 5th semester, Department of English, wants to know from you, if Shukanta Bhattacharya had lived more, should he have been more tempered in his writing style? Because when he is 1920, he was more of a rebellion, like any other concerned teenager who wants to break everything that is wrong. So do you think that if he would have lived longer, he would have made another Birendra Chattopadhyay or Subhash Mukhopadhyay? This is her question.
Yeah.
Please, sir.
Thank you so much. And that's a fantastic question, Nipanjali. And frankly, I do not always have a very easy answer or a ready answer about if people had lived that written better or sort of richer, become richer. We read John Keats in our sort of syllabuses, right? John Keats lived for 24 years, I guess, and or 26, I don't remember. And he wrote this poem that we often read, Ode to a Nightingale. And the poem is so intricate and complex in everything, and not only in its form and style, but also in its meaning making, right? There have been so many different kinds of readings of Ode to a Nightingale, or any kind of other, like Ode on a Grecian Aunt, for instance. Again, if you remember, most of the younger generation romantic poets died very young. Percy Bysshe Shelley, then Lord Byron, of course, Keats, all of these poets that died probably at the age of 30 or even within early 30s. But yet their poetry has gone on to become almost timeless. We are reading him again and again, almost 200 years later, more than 200 years later. So point here is, and probably Shukanto will also live, right? His 19-year-old, 20-year-old Shukanto writing this particular poem will probably go on to live. And if we have had the access to the European discussions, and the translations were more widely read in European circles, which continue to shape power dynamics in terms of literary and commercial aspects, then probably Shukanto would have been an epic, and Shukanto would have been a hugely popular poet, because he could make sure in 8 lines he would bring out something which Charles Baudelaire from France would appreciate a lot. Now, or Mallarmé, somebody a lot of French minimalist poets. Now, that's where I come from, that whether his poetry would be tempered, whether his poetry would be different, is something we cannot conjecture, precisely because a lot of his poetry is also ideologically shaped, right? And whether he would go on to keep that ideologies forward, to take them forward with him later on in the 50s and 60s, is something to only guess, conjecture, rather than to have any conclusive answer about. But I understand the question here, that like Subhash Mukhopadhyay or Birendra Chattopadhyay, they are also as much in the activist domain as Shukanto is. Birendra Chattopadhyay, if you remember, had written a very famous I don't know how famous it is in literary circles today, but I liked it a lot when I was reading it in my college days. It's called Aschorjo Bhater Gandho. This is like a 6-line poem about that astonishing smell of rice, which um, which people still serve, which people still eat. And that's what he's writing in 6 lines. I just read a paper somewhere in another college recently, and I brought these two together to show how increasingly poets are taking to a shorter form of poetry rather than a longer form of analysis, precisely because the subject is so difficult to deal with: hunger. How do you epitomize hunger or write an epic about hunger, right? You could write an epic about social crisis, such as T.S. Eliot's, let's say, The Wasteland. But hunger, it's such an excruciating pain one goes through to write about hunger, because all of us, in different ways, with our relative privilege, have somehow experienced hunger in our daily basis. Maybe we have not had the option to eat a particular day's meal once, and we felt through our body what it goes through, right? So that kind of a situation on a tremendously longer, in a sense, a tremendously sustained, which is difficult to sustain in poetry. So that's my understanding, that poetry becomes increasingly shorter in form and what is understood as more modernist in imagery. In that way, Shukanto was doing at the age of 20 what anybody, probably Birendra Chattopadhyay at the age of 50 could do. If he was writing an 8-line poem in 1946 at the age of 20, Birendra Chattopadhyay is writing Aschorjo Bhater Gandho in 1965 at the age of 47. So both of them are probably on the same page here. So that's the confusion to me, that whether we should judge a poet by the relative maturity or immaturity of their age.
Thank you, sir, for your elaborate illumination on the question. I think Nipanjali got her answer. So I'm just forwarding you another question put by Ahona Roy. She is also a student of 5th semester. She is asking, what is the key to recognizing conventions in literature?
Right. Thanks very much, Ahona, for the question. For me, see, that's the thing about conventions and literature, is that increasingly, as you come to get taught in colleges, and we have had our undergraduate days as well, literature is organized around literary history. Well, I mean, the way we read in college in 2006, 7, this kind of early first decade of 2000, is that literature is about, so we read a paper on literary history, like how, for instance, from the Old English to medieval English to sort of, as you know, probably would very well know, from there to Renaissance, and then kind of Augustine, and then Romantic, etc. So the kind of stages of literary history. That's, I'm talking about English literary history, of course. And then we read literature around genres. So novels, one paper about novels, one paper about poetry, one paper about, let's say, drama, etc., etc. Now, or Indian writings in English, which was a new thing to be brought in around that time. So of course, the syllabuses were taking cognizance of the fact that new things were coming up and the canon needs to be opened. So Indian English or American literature were the new imports back then. Today, I saw your syllabus and I thought that this syllabus looks fascinating. Like how even Emily Dickinson could be taught with Maya Angelou, and Maya Angelou need not be an American poet here. Is excellent. To me, it's a very good sort of grouping. But again, the problem rises is, this is an age-old controversy, or let's say a debate, that people who have read literary history on a paper-wise basis, and they believe that they know English literature, at least they understand how to situate or historically situate a poet or a novelist, and those who are reading them together in the sort of a cohort where American, Australian, Indian, and English poets are brought together, then there is a confusion about how to historicize them. Are all of them talking about the same thing? Probably all of them are talking about important converging issues, but it probably sort of, the responsibility is as much onto teachers as to students about making sure that these poets are not to be interchanged with. They are writing about their particular histories, and those histories are allowing them to give shape to a particular crisis, maybe gender crisis, which Emily Dickinson is writing from Britain in a particular way, and Maya Angelou is writing about her African race and African American race in a particular way, and that is definitely way different from how Mahashweta Devi is writing Draupadi, right? So this is very important that we remember these distinctions. And to talk, like give you another like a quick notation about organizing literature, something that I particularly am following right now in my research is how to organize literature or the conventions of literature around, let's say, disasters or around, let's say, environment. Could there be a literary reading, a reading of literature around land, around environment? How would that look? So if gender is the organizing category in women's writing in your paper, how about there could be an organizing category such as resources, land, water, sort of, food, and what literary works in around the world talk about this resources in their writing. So for instance, I could refer say for instance Shukanto here in one breath with, say for instance, an Australian Aboriginal poet writing about food and land. But at the same time, I think the university syllabus are already doing it, and doing it in a very compelling manner, that they're bringing these people together around a single theme. But again, as I remind you, the specificities need not be lost out to that particular organizing theme.
Thank you, sir. Maureen, student of our department, has asked you whether there is any basic contrast between English and Bengali literature.
Yes, this is a big question in a very appropriately put sort of interrogatory sentence, right? So the Bengali and English literature distinction, this is huge, and I probably wouldn't have time to talk about the nitty-gritty of it all. But just to remind you that literature, I believe, as I said in the beginning, I believe is inherently comparative. When you read literature, when you read Tuntunir Golpo, remember that when we have been reading Tuntunir Golpo, Ghonada, Nonte Fonte, etc. in our Bengali comics, these Bengali comics were being drawn from not only American or British comics, but also Russian comics and Eastern European comics, right? So Tuntunir Golpo, how many of you would read it not as Thakurmar Jhuli, but as a Russian fairy tale story, right? So that kind of comparativism in terms of its theme and in terms of its content and form is inherent in literary works. So in that way, in Bengali and English literature, for that matter, any literature could be brought together, which has been done recently, and more so in the name under the category under world literature. But again, what happens here is that, again, I keep reminding my students as well that you are absolutely welcome to read Rabindranath and, let's say, Balzac together, right? But at the same time, Balzac doesn't know anything about what's going on in Swadeshi or 1910 Bengal. So, but Rabindranath, because we are from a colonial territory, might know more about what's going on in France and England. Rabindranath is huge. Rabindranath cannot be compared with a lot of people, because Rabindranath was widely traveled as somebody going to Iran and Chile and Argentina. Impossible to imagine in the current world scenario, where people and poets and writers are increasingly becoming parochial. So in that particular scenario, and of course Rabindranath had the access, right? He had the money, he had the capital to move forward, to go, which not many poets and writers have. So I am not blaming poets and writers not to be able to travel, but it's just that Rabindranath was a jomidar, like a landlord. We need not forget that as well. So in that scenario, if you are bringing these two writers together, Balzac also was a sort of wealthy sort of writer. So bring them together without sacrificing or sort of not compromising their historical and cultural specificities. There might be convergences. There might be convergences in form. There might be interchangeability in form. It might be that Rabindranath is drawing from Balzac, or it might be that Balzac, without his knowing of it, is drawing from Bankim Chandra. You never know that. And in that way, the contrast remains porous. The contrast remains blurring, if you are bringing them onto this kind of a wider literary theoretical plane. But the contrast is always strong, precisely because they belong to not only two different geographical territories with their distinct cultural orientations, but also two historically advantaged and disadvantaged territories. England was a colonizer, India was colonized, and that consciousness is always there in the writing. If you read Rabindranath or Gora, for instance, is the epitome of that consciousness, right? The consciousness of mixed race, the consciousness of being sort of historically disadvantaged because being colonized, and the consciousness of, look at the amount of racial discrimination that people like Jagadish Chandra Bose, Acharya Prafulla Chandra Ray, all of them had to go through in the UK. So that why one is chosen to be great and awarded a Nobel Prize also has a power dynamics behind it. Remember that thing as well.
Nipanjali's question once again. She's trying to know from you whether the poems that are becoming quite short in form nowadays mean that we are becoming more controlled in our expressions. Are we becoming more reserved, or the opposite? Reticence is eloquence. This is her question.
Yes. Thank you, Nipanjali, once again. My quick answer to that will be, I do not really know whether voluminousness is about being joyful. I mean, if I write page after page, am I necessarily being happy about the writing? So, or if I write like just 5 pages and consider it as a short story, then am I being like less joyful, right? So in that sense, my feeling is, of course, poetry and novels, the kind of their length, of course, were shaped by the modernist and the capitalist alienation they felt, as these are things that they talk about. So for instance, Jean-Paul Sartre would talk about how alienation had a deep impact on his writing, the kind of alienation that Adorno talks about in lyric poetry. That's something that I quoted from, that we do not do anything in community any longer. We are becoming increasingly individualistic. So maybe poetry and novels need to sort of redo their form, right, their content. But look at today's world. Salman Rushdie, another major Indian, or let's say British writer, Indian British writer, or post-colonial writer, wrote like 600 pages, right, for a novel. And then Gabriel Garcia Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude, as brilliant as it is long, like page after page. But it is about social crisis, again, about a crisis in a transitional crisis. Look at anything that you come across, you know, Haruki Murakami, again, another popular name in world literature, writes like page after page. So point being, are they now being more happy, or are they now being more sort of confident about their situation worldwide, or does writing more or less come from a particular condition that one is dealing with? I mean, could War and Peace be written, or A Suitable Boy be written in 100 pages? So could the analysis that Tolstoy is making in that particular book of social life in sort of France's invasion of Russia, could that be, and the impact of it in a particular family? That could be like a short story, but he made sure that the narrator plays a role of a social commentator. That must not be lost. And that's the role that Victorian authors have been doing, something that even the post-colonial authors have been following via the modernist writers. Sartre's, if you read any novel by Sartre, he does come across as a very forceful social commentator, but he's making sure that those commentary does not become like an ubiquitous omnipresence narrator who knows everything. And that's where the unreliability of narrator comes in. How far can you trust a narrator that he knows or she knows everything about that? So that kind of an understanding, I feel, about the longevity or the length of writing should also take note of the fact that what condition somebody is able to, or somebody is actually talking about, and why somebody chooses to write long and why somebody chooses to write short is also maybe a historical question in that sense, as if they were dealing with specific historical conditions.
Sir, this is the last question in today's interactive session posed by Pooja Vishwas, and she's wanting to know, do you think it is true that these days poetry is not as much written as other literary genres, such as novel? And if yes, why? What is the reason behind that?
Yeah. This is a question that nails it. Of course, that this is a very important question in the sense that we have a feeling about that, right? That poetry is written less, than novels, because novels are more visible. Now, that's the question, that is poetry written less, or is it that poetry is less visible? Now, why is something less visible? Why is somebody given not, and how does visibility work in the world of literary global market? If somebody gets a prize, often you see a literary prize, a Booker Prize, a Nobel Prize, or even in India, Crosswords Prize. You see that mostly these are novelists. That doesn't mean that there are no poets. It just means that our reading habits have increasingly turned towards prose fiction. And it also relates to the market that we all tread. It has been told that by critics that novel is the consequence of bourgeois capitalism, that theater lost out to novels. If theater was about feudal and aristocratic lords, about their lives and about the wealthy art merchants, think about any plays you have read uh, from Shakespeare onward till, let's say, even the Augustan period, right? Even Oscar Wilde wrote whatever plays, the Comedy of Manners, essentially a comedy of upper caste people. So that kind of a consciousness of, let's say, quote unquote, the oppressed classes or the proletariat isn't coming out until the socialist realism or some kind of a melodramatic socialist theater is coming about peasants, right? And that is not coming out. So novels in between this kind of a wealthy upper caste, I'm talking about Europe here, not India, between this wealthy upper class and in between peasants, let's say 1870s and 1940s, there is the growth of the novel. Or let's say, sorry, 1740s and 1940s, the novel is growing up because bourgeois, as in a middle class, is rising. Middle class, the concept of a middle class is being born precisely because of its reading habits and its exploration of frontiers in market. A new form of class is being based on the landlords and absentee landlords. So these are important factors for the rise of novels. As long as middle class and classes that we all belong, educated classes, they continue to have a strong hold about reading habits, novel will continue to rise, will continue to be the dominant factor. That doesn't mean that poetry is not being written. If you remember, the first most important effects, or most important responses, or most visible responses to a catastrophe such as a pandemic comes from short form and mostly poetry. Think about Gulzar, who penned a poem about the migrant crisis in India. Think about even Tapsi Pannu, who penned a very heartrending poem about the migrant crisis in India. Most of this crisis will be brought forth in the poetic form. It's just that poetry is not given always the wider acknowledgement of its presence as novels are. And probably to change that front, poetry is being sort of acknowledged widely in the Nobel Prize, at least. So for instance, this year's Nobel Prize in literature went to a poet. A few years back, it went to Bob Dylan. So poetry and songs are being sort of once again given their due. So, and because they're not essentially about social crisis, but of course, as Adorno says, they are about social crisis. We are just not reading them or not looking for them where they should be, we should be looking at.
Koil, I think there is another question. Shorit, can we take another question? Are you comfortable with that?
Yes, yes. I just lost the connection for the time being. There is a question by Antorlina Roy. She's asking, sir, do you think that an essay is more effective than a poem?
Yeah. Thanks, Antolina. I mean, I feel essays are direct, right? They have a different form altogether. When we say that an essay is more effective than a poem, we are having a particular agenda with an essay and a poem. An essay is about, say, for instance, newspaper essays or articles, or even like an essay written on a satire written on social life. There are always going to be more people reading because it's easy to access, right? If somebody is written something in Robi Basorio, for instance, in Anandabazar Potrika, and about satirizing the social form, everybody will, because Bengali language is amenable and accessible to a wider body, Bengali prose language, precisely because they're dealing with a colloquial language. And this, if the same social crisis comes across in a poem, is there in a poem, then the poem has to deal it with in a oblique manner with its own conventions, style, from something that we discussed, right? Style, rhythm, versification, etc., etc. So that will be not always very accessible. But of course, it could be that a poem is much more. If the poems were less effective, would you at all be listening to songs, which is the basis of poems?
Thank you, sir. Another question. Actually, students are putting in questions now. So I'm forwarding those questions to you. A question from Rifat Sultana, student of third year English honors. She has asked you a couple of questions together. What sorts of things does imaginative literature teach us? This is the first question. Second, is imaginative literature a luxury or an essential aspect of the human experience? The third question, should the teaching of imaginative literature be included in the educational curriculum as a required subject, or at least it should be there as an elective? This is her question.
Yes. Thank you for your questions. I think you answered your question already in the second one, that imaginative literature, like what we are dealing with here in literary departments, it is called imaginative aspects, right? The imaginary. Well, Maya Angelou imagined that her life is like a bird. That's where he tried to give it a particular form, a free bird and a caged bird, right? So, so literature is essentially imaginary. If it is not, it would have been journalism, essentially, right? I do not mean to say that journalism is not imaginary or imaginative, but journalism has to do in-field experience and to reproduce them in a more cut and dried fashion that literature might want to avoid. So literature, by being literature, is imaginative. But, and I'm following here not the broad understanding of literature as literature review, but whether literature should be part of the education curriculum, I think, of course, literature is pedagogy. I mean, this is the first thing. Literature is about narration. Literature is about storytelling. Who in the world who has had access to maybe like another person in family never come across a story, let alone stories about children, etc., and any kind of story? Even if somebody had the misfortune of not having a family, may come across a story elsewhere. So when we are born and we grow up with stories. And these are the stories we continue to enjoy in literature and films, in artistic forms. So even if we are not putting them in educational curricula, we are actually doing that by teaching them. Remember, when you are giving an example, you are basically telling a story. Every time somebody gives an example, to give a better understanding of it, they're actually telling a story. So I believe that this is already there in the educational curriculum. It's just that not always this kind of understanding is put forward, that literature and pedagogy are intrinsically tied.
Question by Ankona Bishar, third year student. Can you please guide as how to establish oneself in a, she's asking a very utilitarian question. She's asking you how to establish oneself in a foreign land pursuing English literature, like you, sir. How to prepare oneself for it from the postgraduate level. This is the question. Antorlina, please mute your mic. Antorlina.
Yes, thanks for the question. It's just that I mean, I have given a few talks about how to prepare, and I have a YouTube channel about that. So anybody who is interested in pursuing a PhD in English literature in the UK or in Europe, I'm sort of suggesting you check out my YouTube channel, where I have given like 3 sort of talks on application and on funding and on sort of writing a research proposal. So that is where even people have asked a lot of questions in those sessions. So you might get a lot of information already there. But eventually, ideally speaking, what you would need is a very strong research proposal and a good CV with publications maybe already, or if not publications, then maybe a proposal that speaks very honestly about what you want to work on and why it is important that you want to work on them, and also about making sure that you have some funding understanding, because the PhDs will be absolutely a lot of money, just to make it like more cut and dried. And if you have a funding from India, it's much better. But if you're going for funding from within the UK, which is very few and far between, it is going to be an increasingly very competitive body. Maybe like for 5 funding sort of what is it called, funds, there are probably going to be 1,000 applications. So just make sure that you have this preparation, and I would suggest you check these videos I have put up on the YouTube channel. You can just write my name and YouTube will have the channel.
Thank you, sir. Perhaps the last question today by Srina Roy Choudhury. She wants to know from you, do you think that subjective poetry has completely lost its relevance in modern times?
Thank you, Srina. I think it has not, let alone completely. If it has been, as I said in the other question, in response to the other question, I mean, is that had it lost its meaning, then poetry, which is the basis of songs, right, would have lost its meaning. And poetry, as long as poetry songs are dealing with tragedy, crisis, something we call sad songs, about some kind of a crisis, be it human crisis, personal, domestic, or be it social, public crisis, then they would have lost their meaning altogether. If people are humming songs, they're actually humming poetry. So in that sense, again, my suggestion will be to remind us, what are we actually aiming to do with literary genres? Are we aiming to compete one genre against another to find out how successful one is and how periodically successful one has been, or to appreciate their intrinsic conventions and their intrinsic stylistic sort of specificities? And that is, if you do that, if you do not bring them onto a league table ranking who is better, who is wrong, you will understand that they're all talking about specific registers and specific problems. So Sukanto and Maya Angelou might not know each other, but we are still reading their poetry in the modern times. And today, plenty of poets are already writing. Gluck, who won the Nobel Prize, is a living poet, right? She's being read. And maybe she will be read more widely now that she has gone like a widely known prize in literature. But that's the thing. I believe that poetry is around in songs, in verses, but the recitation, the practice of poetry is losing meaning precisely because we as a generation have decided that we would like to be more into the world of prose and global sort of literary market than to give it the poetry the time that it demands to be read aloud. Okay, so I believe that, okay, it has not at all. If we are just sort of widening the canon and looking out for poetry, you will see fantastic poetry today, especially from Dalit and feminist poets from India. Fantastic poetry. It's just that we are not reading them aloud. Look at your own syllabus. Look at the diversity of your syllabus. If you just now contemporize it even more, you will see that brilliant poets are coming out with a lot of strength and with a lot of resistance to the dominant genres and markets. We are just probably not always being attentive to them.
It was such an illuminating session. Thank you so much, sir. And I hand over the mic to Professor Parthapratim Mondol to continue with the webinar.
Thank you.
Well, Shorit, it was really, I thought you were very patient there. You addressed each and every question very sincerely. That's indeed very, very impressive. And I'm really, I can't thank enough. It's really a beauty of this online lecture series that someone who is teaching in UK, he had been able to interact with our students. It had been quite blissful for them, really. It's what they want. This is the motivation that they would be needing in such a time of crisis. I can't thank you enough from my side, and in future when we plan a more proper quote-unquote seminar, we would really like you to have there. So finally, I would hand over the reign to our Professor Kia Ghatak. She would deliver the vote of thanks, and then our session would end. Kia Di.
At first, on behalf of the Department of English at Baharampur Girls College, I want to express my heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Shaurit Bhattacharya, UK, for enriching our mind by delivering his lecture regarding how to read literature, prose and comparative readings. But Shakespeare has pointed out in his sonnet number 18, and every fear from fear sometimes declines, unquote. We have enjoyed the taste of reading different types of poetry. Students have got a clear idea regarding how to read poetry well. But just as the word forlorn has forced kids to come back into the reality of world, similarly, the clutch of time has reminded me to perform my duty of thanksgiving towards the end of this fair session of third online lecture series. My special thanks goes to Professor Dr. Niladi Ranjan Chatterjee, Head of the Department of English of University of Kalyani, for his continuous support and guidance as a patron to make this lecture series effective and fruitful. I am grateful to Dr. Hena Sinha, the principal of our college, for her untiring help and sincere effort for making this lecture series successful. I extend my deep regards to all the members of the governing body of our college. Thanks are due to each and every teacher of English department, Dr. Parthasarathi Guha, Head of the Department of English, Professor Parthopati Mondol, Professor Binoy Dangar, Professor Koel Ganguly, and Professor Kajal Kumar Saha, for dedicating their heart and soul to increase the glory of this lecture series. I want to convey my best compliments to our technician, Shikanto Bosak, for his continuous support. I would like to thank all participants, including teachers of Baharampur Girls College and our beloved students who are the main spirit of this lecture series. Once again, I want to thank all of you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much again for inviting me. And again, I would like to my best wishes for the rest of the lectures and for any interviews you take. And it has been a very entertaining session and a very instructive session for me as well. And I wish all the best to the students as well with your interests and also with your reading habits and with your sort of research and academic aspirations. All the best.
Okay, so here we bring our session to a formal end. Thank you everyone for being present here.